You hear the roar before you see anything. It's not human, it's animal, guttural, echoing off stone walls. Your wrists are raw where the iron digs in. Your knees burn against sand so hot it's blistering your skin. You can't turn around. They made sure of that. But you know what's behind you. You've heard the rumors. You've seen the cages. And now the crowd, 50,000 voices, is screaming for it to begin. This is Constantinople. The year is 537 AD, and you are about to witness something that will haunt the Byzantine Empire for generations. Before we go deeper, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. It genuinely amazes me that a story this dark, from so long ago, still reaches people in every corner of the world. Now let's continue, because what comes next is almost impossible to believe. Her name was Mariana. She was 19 years old, born into a family of silk merchants who had aligned themselves with the wrong political faction. In Byzantium, that was enough. Enough to lose everything. Enough to end up here in the Hippodrome of Constantinople, chained in the center of an arena that had already drunk the blood of 30,000 people just 5 years earlier. The Nika riots had turned this place into a slaughterhouse. But what the Byzantines did after the massacre was somehow worse. They transformed the Hippodrome into a theater of calculated humiliation, a stage where enemies of the state were not just killed, they were broken. Mariana had been in the holding cells beneath the arena for 6 days. No food, no water, no explanation. Just darkness and the sound of other women crying. 73 women had been arrested in the purge following the Blue faction's failed uprising. Most were wives, daughters, sisters of men who had bet on the wrong political alliance. Byzantine law was clear. Women could not be executed without a trial. But the law said nothing about what could be done to them in public, and the Hippodrome had become the empire's favorite loophole. When the guards came for her that morning, they didn't speak. They simply dragged her up stone stairs, worn smooth by centuries of feet gladiators, charioteers, condemned prisoners. She emerged into blinding sunlight and a wall of sound that hit her like a physical force. The Hippodrome could hold 100,000 people, but today maybe 50,000 had come. That was enough, more than enough. They had come to see justice, or what the empire called justice. She was naked except for a strip of sackcloth. Her hair had been shorn, not cut, torn, leaving patches of scalp bleeding. 2 guards held her arms as she was marched along the spina, the central barrier that divided the racing track. Every step, the crowd grew louder. She could hear individual voices now, insults, threats, laughter. Things were being thrown: rotten fruit, stones, human waste. One struck her shoulder, another hit her face, splitting her lip. She tasted blood and kept walking because stopping meant being dragged, and being dragged meant even more humiliation. At the center of the arena, they forced her to her knees, then onto all fours. The iron shackles were hammered into place wrists, ankles each strike of the mallet ringing out across the Hippodrome. The sand beneath her was hot enough to burn. She could feel it scorching her palms, her knees. The sun was merciless. Constantinople in summer. No shade, no mercy. Just heat and shame and the eyes of 50,000 strangers. And then she heard it. The sound that made her blood turn to ice. A bull, not the roar of a lion or the snarl of a leopard. Those were Roman entertainments. Pagan excesses the Christian Byzantines claimed to have abolished. No, this was something different, something the empire had designed specifically for women who threatened the political order. The bull was not there to kill her. It was there to terrorize her, to strip away every last fragment of dignity in front of the largest possible audience. You need to understand what the Hippodrome really was. Yes, it hosted chariot races. Yes, it was the social center of Constantinople, the place where factions gathered, where emperors appeared before their people. But by the 6th century, it had become something else. An instrument of state terror so sophisticated that its methods would be studied and replicated by empires for the next 1,000 years. The architecture itself was designed for control, 400 meters long, 100 meters wide, rising tiers of stone seats that created a natural amplifier for crowd noise. At the eastern end stood the kathisma, the imperial box, where the emperor sat elevated above everyone else, watching, judging, demonstrating his power through his presence or absence. Below the arena floor ran a network of tunnels and chambers where prisoners were held, where equipment was stored, where preparations were made for spectacles the crowd would never forget. But the most important architectural feature was the gates. All of them could be sealed from the outside. This was not an accident. This was intentional design. Because the Hippodrome was not just a venue for entertainment, it was a trap that could be sprung at any moment, turning spectators into victims, turning a crowd into a captive audience for massacre. That's what happened during the Nika riots. For 1 week in January 532 AD, both the blue and green factions' bitter enemies who had rioted against each other for decades united against Emperor Justinian. They filled the Hippodrome, 50,000 strong, chanting a single word, Nika, victory. Not for their chariots, victory over the emperor. They demanded he abdicate, demanded he remove corrupt officials, demanded an end to crushing taxation. Justinian made a decision that would define his reign. He ordered the gates sealed, every exit. Then he sent in General Belisarius with 3,000 soldiers, heavy infantry, swords, and spears. No bows, no ranged weapons. This was going to be intimate work. The killing lasted 6 hours. 30,000 people died in the Hippodrome. The soldiers moved methodically through the stands, section by section, row by row, stabbing anyone they could reach. People tried to climb the walls, tried to break through the sealed gates. Some jumped from the upper tiers, 30 feet down, onto stone, dying on impact. The screaming could be heard across the entire city. By nightfall, the sand of the arena floor was no longer visible beneath the blood. Bodies were piled so high in the aisles that soldiers had to climb over corpses to reach people hiding behind them. It was the largest stadium massacre in human history, and it taught the survivors a lesson they would never forget. The empire could and would kill tens of thousands of its own citizens to maintain order. But Justinian wasn't finished. While the massacre was happening, his officials went through the stands, identifying specific individuals' faction leaders, wealthy families who had funded the opposition, nobles whose loyalty was questionable. These people were not killed in the crowd. They were pulled aside, held for something else. Among them were 73 women. What the empire did to these women in the weeks after Nika established a pattern that would be repeated for centuries. They could not be executed, not legally, not without trials the empire didn't want to hold, but they could be displayed, humiliated, broken in public, as warnings to anyone else who might consider opposing imperial authority. The Byzantines called these spectacles processions of shame. The process was methodical. First, the women were held in the chambers beneath the Hippodrome for days, sometimes weeks, denied food and water, beaten occasionally, but not severely. The damage had to be visible, but not disabling. Their hair was cut or shaved, their clothing was replaced with rags or removed entirely. Then came the public display. One by one, they were brought into the arena during regular racing days, between events, as entertainment for the crowd. They were forced to walk the entire circuit of the track 400 meters, while the crowd was encouraged to shout, to jeer, to throw refuse. Some women collapsed and were dragged to their feet. Some wept openly. Some maintained silence through sheer force of will. All were photographed in memory, their degradation becoming stories told and retold across the empire. At the end of the walk, they were made to kneel in the center of the arena. A herald would read their crime supporting treason, harboring rebels, failing to control their male relatives. Then their punishment would be announced: exile, confiscation of property, permanent social disgrace. They would be led away, sent to distant provinces, their names becoming synonyms for shame. But for some women, the procession of shame was not enough. For women whose families had been particularly powerful, whose opposition had been particularly visible, the empire needed something more memorable, something that would be talked about for years, something that would make other women think twice before stepping outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior. That's where the animals came in. The Byzantines were Christian. They claimed moral superiority over pagan Rome, condemned gladiatorial combat as barbaric, frowned on beast hunts as excessive cruelty. But they found other uses for animals, uses designed not to kill but to degrade, to create psychological trauma more than physical harm, to break people through terror and humiliation rather than through blood and death. The bulls used in these spectacles were specially selected and trained. Massive animals, over 1,000 pounds, chosen for their size and intimidating presence. But they were not wild. They were conditioned through months of careful work in the imperial stables, taught to respond to commands, to move on cue, to approach but not attack. The handlers were experts, men who understood animal behavior and human psychology equally well. What they created was theater. Carefully choreographed performances designed to maximize fear while minimizing actual physical harm. Because a dead woman was just a dead woman. But a broken woman, a woman who survived her ordeal and lived with the memory, who carried the shame and trauma for however many years, remained a herd. That was a message that kept sending itself, kept warning others, kept demonstrating the reach and creativity of imperial power. Mariana could hear the bull now, the heavy thud of its hooves on stone, the snorting breath, the crack of whips as guards drove it forward. The crowd's noise changed, rising to a fever pitch of anticipation. She was facing away from the gates, unable to see what was approaching, only hear it getting closer and closer. The anticipation was part of the design, the not knowing, the imagination filling in details worse than reality. They positioned the bull directly behind her, close enough that she could feel its heat, smell its animal scent, mixed with her own fierce sweat. The crowd fell into a strange pattern of noise rhythmic, chanting, placing bets on how long she would hold out, whether she would scream, whether she would beg. The terror was absolute. Mariana's mind raced through every possibility, every horror she had heard whispered about these spectacles. The bull's breath was hot and wet on her exposed back. She could feel its massive head lowering toward her. Every muscle in her body was rigid with fear. She couldn't move, couldn't escape, could only kneel there, chained, waiting for whatever was about to happen. Minutes passed. They felt like hours. The guards let it play out, let the fear do its work, let her imagination create torments worse than any physical assault. The psychological destruction was the point, breaking her completely, reducing her to pure animal terror in front of 50,000 witnesses who would remember, who would tell the story, who would use her name as a warning to other women who might forget their place. The handlers controlled every moment. They brought the bull close, then pulled it back slightly, let it approach again. The animal's presence was overwhelming its size, its smell, its breath, the sound of its hooves scraping stone. Mariana was shaking so violently the chains rattled. Sweat and tears mixed with the blood from her torn scalp, dripping onto the burning sand. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the guards pulled the bull away, led it back toward the gates. Mariana collapsed forward, still chained, still on all fours, sobbing uncontrollably, her body convulsing. The crowd erupted, some cheering, some laughing, some in horrified silence, but all of them changed by what they had witnessed. She had been destroyed without being touched. That was the genius of it. No permanent physical damage, no marks that would make martyrs, just complete psychological annihilation performed as public entertainment under the banner of Christian justice. Mariana was released the next day, sent into exile to a convent on the Black Sea coast, where she lived another 18 months before dying of what the records call melancholy, a broken heart, a broken mind, unable to escape the memory of that day when 50,000 people watched her reduced to helpless prey. But her destruction achieved its purpose. Other noble women saw what happened. Other families adjusted their political calculations. Other potential opponents made different choices. All because of a bull and a woman and calculated terror disguised as spectacle. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you. They don't tell you about the nightmares Mariana had every night for those 18 months. How she would wake up screaming, feeling phantom breath on her back. How she flinched at every sound, every shadow. How she stopped speaking after the first month, withdrew into silence so complete the other nuns thought she had taken a vow. They don't tell you about the letter her younger sister wrote to the emperor, begging for clemency, for permission to visit. The letter was returned unopened. The message was clear. Mariana had ceased to exist as far as the empire was concerned. She had been erased socially, if not physically. They don't tell you that 3 other women underwent similar ordeals in the months following Nika. Different animals, same principle. One with a trained bear that was paraded around her, but never allowed to touch. One with dogs that snarled and snapped, but were held on leashes just out of reach. Each spectacle carefully designed, each woman carefully selected for maximum political impact. And they definitely don't tell you that these methods didn't end with Justinian. They were refined over centuries, passed down through imperial administrations, recorded in manuals that no longer survive, but whose effects echo through Byzantine history. The Hippodrome remained a theater of terror for over 800 more years until the empire finally collapsed and the building fell into ruin. The ruins of the Hippodrome still exist in modern Istanbul. You can walk there today, stand on ground where 30,000 people were massacred, touch stones that witnessed unimaginable cruelty. Most tourists have no idea. They see ancient architecture, photo opportunities, a historical site between the Blue Mosque and Hagia Sophia. But the stones remember, the dust of that arena contains the remains of thousands of forgotten victims, people whose names were erased, whose suffering was sanitized, whose stories were buried under centuries of historical revisionism that prefers to remember Byzantium as a civilization of mosaics and legal codes and theological debates. The truth is darker. The Byzantine Empire was a Christian civilization that claimed moral superiority over pagan Rome, while developing methods of public humiliation and terror that the Romans never imagined. They refined cruelty into a science. They transformed the Hippodrome from a racing venue into a machine for manufacturing consent through trauma. They understood that the most effective way to control a population is not through random violence, but through spectacular, memorable displays that imprint themselves on collective memory. Mariana's story is not unique. It's a pattern repeated across centuries, across empires, across every system that concentrates power and demands absolute obedience. The Hippodrome was just one venue, 1,000 years of evidence. But the methods survive, the patterns persist. What happened in Constantinople didn't stay in Constantinople. It became a template, studied and replicated by every empire that came after. The architecture changes, the justifications evolve, but the core mechanism remains the same: public humiliation as political control, trauma as tool, spectacle as terror. There's a crack in the stone floor of the Hippodrome, visible even now 15 centuries later, that runs from the center of the arena toward the eastern gates. Local guides tell tourists it's from an earthquake. But the Byzantine chronicles mention something else. They say it appeared the day after the Nika massacre. When the weight of 30,000 bodies was finally removed and the earth itself seemed to recoil from what had soaked into it, that crack is still there, growing wider each year, as if the ground is still trying to distance itself from the memory of what it witnessed, as if stone itself can carry trauma and pass it forward through time. As if some events are so terrible that they leave marks, nothing can erase, not centuries, not earthquakes, not the careful work of empires trying to sanitize their history. Mariana died at 21 years old, trapped forever in the moment when she knelt in burning sand. Hearing a bull approach, feeling 50,000 eyes on her degradation, she never escaped the Hippodrome. None of them did. Not the 30,000 massacred during Nika, not the 73 women paraded in shame, not the rebels, the unfortunate souls who found themselves on the wrong side of imperial power. They remain in the stones and dust, waiting to be remembered, proof that what was called civilization and faith also forged terror. Speak their names, and admit the empire's cruelty was real.